Random thoughts. In this video, we are going to read part of Douglas Jardine's book, The Mad Mullah. This is a book that was published in early 20th century. That's early 1920s, actually. And it's a book that is about Mohammed Abdul Hassan. It's some sort of his biography, actually. Now, Douglas Jardine served as secretary to the administration of Somaliland between 1916 and 1921. Now, in this book, of course, as I've said, is sort of a biography of Mohammed Abdul Hassan. And we are still in chapter one. And in chapter one, he's basically giving us the backdrop. He's told us about the geography of the land, the climate, the people, the culture, the history. He's giving us all this information that I guess he thought we needed for us to understand or to follow the story of Mohammed Abdul Hassan when he starts telling it. And I've made several videos, of course, talking about different things that he brings up in the first chapter. And this video, we are going to talk about poetry. And I know I've talked about poetry a few times in other videos, especially when I was doing, I was reading the book, First Steps in East Africa by Richard Burton. We did talk about poetry and how important poetry is in the Somali culture, because the Somalis primarily used to record their history in poetry, and they used to have information moved from one generation to another through poetry, and even information being taken from one point to another through poetry. Poetry was the vehicle of passing information. Now, Jardine does discuss that actually, and he tells us that the Somali have something for poetry, and not just poetry, but also they are very good orators. We are going to read the part where he talks about those skills among the Somali people. Now, he says this. First, he's going to talk about poetry, and then he'll talk about how good they are as orators. And he says there is a very pronounced poetic strain in the Somalis, and they have a remarkable gift for impromptu verse, which the poet will sing after the Somali fashion on diverse occasions. So it's composed, but sometimes we can say it's done freestyle. And he continued to say, such poems may be heard at dusk after a long march, when seated beside a thorn bush and surrounded by admiring audience. The poet will improvise and croon sad and melodious lines about the incomparable beauty of his wife, the strength of his camels, or as often as not, his own imperishable renown as a warrior. So the topic will be different things, from celebrating their own wives and their own camels, and talking about how they are good warriors and things like that. At dances, which the Somalis are extremely fond, and at marriages, the singing of impromptu verse is a great feature. So even during dances, the verses are part of that, and these verses are impromptu, which means they are basically freestyle. But perhaps the most engaging entertainment the Somali poet can offer is dibaltiq, which is a sort of song and dance on horseback given in honor of some personage, a native chief or some British officer. So there is this special form of poetry that is accompanied by dancing while on horse. It seems like it's a very peculiar or very unique way of doing it. And this is a dance that is done when there is a need to praise or honor somebody of some rank, we can say. And he continued to say, if it be the latter, he will be seated in a chair in some open place with his retinue standing behind him. As soon as everything is ready, the horseman will advance towards him in no definite formation at trot. One of their number, the poet, will be heard singing as he approaches with uplifted spear. Halting his pony within a yard or two of the British officer, he will proceed to sing the latter praises at the top of his voice. Sometimes, overcome by the excitement of the moment, the poet will abandon his main theme to criticize the policy of government, or to drop a hint that the monetary reward will be most acceptable when the entertainment is over. Found this to be very interesting, that there is this guest, say a British officer, and is being honored with this dance and some verse that accompanies it. But then the person, because they are very good at freestyling, they will drop in their information that they needed to get through to the officer, including maybe criticize the policies of government and maybe also say you need to pay us this much for this performance. As soon as the singer is weary, he withdraws with his brother horsemen and they all ride away until they are a quarter of a mile, perhaps from their audience. Then turning around and digging their heels into their ponies' sides, they gallop back, hell for leather, swinging their arms, waving their tops, and belaboring their ponies. When within a few feet of the audience, they suddenly draw up their ponies on their haunches and thus come to a standstill. They shout, "Mot, mot," which means hail, hail. And the audience is supposed to reply in Somali, "Thank you," but his mouth and eyes are generally so full of dust that he is incapable of articulation. Gallop and greetings are repeated several times until the audience retires to his tent. Now, he's talking here about the Somali being very good orators or practicing so much or enjoying doing it. And I need to say this before I even read this part. It is interesting when you read these documents, there's something that becomes apparent, and is that something that is often celebrated in other parts of the world, when it's done by an African, somehow this British officer will find a way to make it negative. And this is a perfect example of that. And I think I've talked about this when I was reading another document. And I think I talked about this aspect where he was talking about how the Swahili of the Kenyan coast was so fond of speaking and talking in very poetic and expressing themselves, trying to be very good orators, and they were so good at it. And this British guy turns it around and gives it a negative tinge. And he says that these people waste a lot of time talking a lot of nothings. They will consume your time in a meeting trying to impress you or others with their oratory skills. And he makes it sound like, and in fact, he did go into discussing how was like trying to imply that the having these oratory skills was more of people of lower rank in the hierarchy, of course, of races, including discussing how he had heard that the Black Americans were making good lawyers because of that. And he was giving it a very negative tint. But then when you read other historical books, have read, for example, from the founding of the cities, a collection of books by Titus Livius about the history of Rome. And in those books, people who are very good orators are highly celebrated. And when you find the Europeans of, say, 20th century discussing the ancient Romans and how their perception about being a good orator, they celebrate it alongside them, or they support that celebration of that being a good orator is a good thing, is a positive thing, is something of a higher, we can say, higher being. But now when it's about an African who's doing the same, there's that negative tinge to it. And we are going to see that happening here. This is what he says. The Somalis are also mean orators, and to be a man of distinction in a tribe, you must have a reputation not only as a fighter and a man of many possessions, but also as a convincing spokesman. So it was a skill that you really needed for you to rise up the ranks in the Somali society, as it is in every other society, actually, even today. People who know how to express themselves and put their ideas ahead and to make their ideas stick, as it is said in some book I've read, Made to Stick, how to make your ideas stick. Those are the people who move forward, and those are the people who are able to move humans to do things, and that is celebrated. But you are going to, as I've said, you are going to see him try to throw in some negativity to it. He continued to say, the Somali orator is usually extremely prolix and very histrionic, but despite this, he is undoubtedly impressive. So there is some negativity here. When he says prolix, it basically means he uses more words that it is necessary. And he also says histrionic, meaning is very dramatic. Now here I can't say that he was being negative. Maybe there's a little bit of that. But he says he's also very dramatic. And he says, but despite that, he can be very impressive in his skill of being an orator. He continued to say, he possesses the first qualification of the public speaker, namely self-confidence, and he has the utmost scorn for any rival. Yeah, and that of course is part of what being a good orator is all about. Confidence, at least. And also, of course, confidence can include, or can be at least be interpreted to mean that you have scorn on the people you are arguing against, or the people you are trying to disapprove, or whose arguments you are trying to disapprove. It might not be the case, but it can easily be interpreted to mean that. Then he continues. The consequence is that whenever a British officer gives an audience to the leaders of a tribe to discuss any political question, he is faced by the prospect of a feast of oratory, which often lasts for a whole day. So you can invite elders of the Somali to a meeting. Now he's complaining that that can go on and on and on and on, and it's not a good thing. Then he continues. The most famous spokesperson of the tribe will be the first to hold forth, careless of repetition and buoyed up with a sense of his own importance. He will state his tribe's case with an unceasing flow of words and gestures. Now you see the negativity here. Now you can see the negativity. Modern politicians and marketers and leaders of all kinds do exactly this, and they need to, because that's how you come across as persuasive. That's how you're going to persuade people with your ideas. But now he's making it sound like it is careless repetitions, and he has this sense of own importance, which you should have to some level, at least if you're going to persuade people. People are not going to be persuaded if they think you're not confident enough. So you can see making it negative. But if you take that description and you look around for everybody who is said to be a very good orator, even today, they have to do that. Like, that's part of what it means to be a good orator, or that's part of what you need to become a good orator. So yeah, he goes on to discuss these. Of course, there is a lot of negativity that is put into it, but when you analyze it, you look at what it describes, and you look at what is accepted as the best way to do your, or to address people, then you realize it's actually what people need to do. But just like I said, there is this theme you get in these colonial documents, where if something is done by an African, even when it's always celebrated in the, we can say, European culture, then it has to be, a negativity has to be attached to it. And it's a very interesting, perspective you see. Yeah, so that's interesting, but we get to, or we, at least when we know the context of it, we know that some of it comes from, it was mostly ego thing, and sometimes they could not align the position an African was supposed to hold, and them doing this thing very good, so they always had to find fault, or maybe for everything to seem seamless in their way of seeing the world, including the Africans and themselves. I think that's what used to happen. Those are my random thoughts.